Finish here, we do our thing, they go turn, 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 turn. That's over. That's more like it. I was studying political science in university, but I had a lot of friends who were working in theater and having a great time. And I enjoyed the time I spent with them more than the time I spent with my fellow political science students. So I was studying in Ottawa. I did 2 years in Memorial and then I moved to Ottawa U. It was at a time you could get funding to study in French. So I was doing my courses in French at the time. And this is a bit of a long story. A friend who was working, who was CODCO adjacent, came to visit and we went to an environmental theater production. And I was just completely overwhelmed by the experience of watching this thing, but also there was some audience participation in it. At the end of my final year of my political science degree, I was taking classes at the Ottawa Dance Centre. They were really kind and supportive, and I vacuumed the studios in exchange for a scholarship. And Nikki Cole came to teach. She was a Canadian based in Vancouver, who was from Vancouver, but who'd been working in London in the UK and was just moving to New York. So I went down to visit her in December of 1976, and I had planned to go for 4 days, and I stayed for 8 months. She just rented a loft and she needed a couple of roommates. So yeah, I moved in there. I mean, there were 50 places where you could study dance, minimum. Every second person on the subway had a dance bag. It was dance paradise. There were like 4 different weekly publications that were dedicated to dance. It was just everywhere. There was just this sense that everything was just exploding. The 80s were really the dance boom. And those of us who participated in that had just that extraordinary sense of optimism where it just felt like everything was growing, and more opportunities, more touring, more performances. There were lots of different studios in the city. Space wasn't as expensive as it was. There were like international series where lots of companies would come and visit, and it really felt like things were just going to get better and better. So in New York, I studied with Nikki, with Alfredo Corvino, which is when I really seriously began to take ballet classes, with Zina Romet, who is a woman who taught a kind of floor bar that was really influential, and lots of other studios I would go and visit. Then when I came back to Canada, I'd been living in Ottawa and there wasn't really much happening there. And I thought I would move to Vancouver because I had some friends there. And I stopped off in Toronto to visit a friend and went to York University where Grant Strati was the director, and had a chat with him in his office. And Monday morning, I was taking an 8:30 ballet class with him, and I was enrolled to do a second degree. So I did a BFA at York, where I spent 2 years. And that's when I began to take classes in Graham technique with Nori Drummond, who was a fantastic teacher. And I really liked that. So it was, yeah, and it was just kind of logical that I would be interested in Toronto Dance Theatre, and luckily they were interested in me. So I think in my second year, I had already done some performances with them, and when I graduated from York, I just went straight into the company. It was amazing. Claudia Moore, Roberto Rosier, Peter Randazzo was still dancing, Chuck Flanders, Renee Highway was my roommate when I joined the company. Yeah, I mean, they were such extraordinary dancers. They were so inspiring, and taking class there was amazing. We did lots of touring. There was just tons of repertoire, being remounted and created all the time. And they were just moving into the new building on Winchester Street then. So, yeah, things were moving, but also it was really interesting. Toronto Dance Theatre had been around for 10 years, and I think taste was beginning to change a little bit, and independent artists started to think, okay, there's something a little old-fashioned about them, and they were really deeply committed to, what David Earl would describe as sort of humanism in contemporary dance, and they stuck to their guns. So there was a little bit of a sense that maybe we weren't the most fashionable company at the time, but that kind of felt fine. Two things happened. One, because I'd begun dancing with Elizabeth, I started with improvisation. So before I had any technique, I had a sense of what I liked about movement, and I wasn't sort of shy about moving in any particular way. And then when I began to choreograph, because I would think I was doing something, but in fact was telling people to do something different, then people would often know, one interesting pattern. I would never have thought of that. And then I just think, well, I didn't think of it either. It just happened like through this miscommunication a bit. So I really began choreographing so that I would have something to dance. I think I had a sense of how I like to move, and then I would just pick up on different. At York, for example, Sandra Caverly was the ballet teacher, and she taught Bournonville technique, which I loved. I just loved all of that beautiful kind of bouncy light. So that, I think, became part of my choreographic style a little bit. You know, qualities in Lamont technique, certainly qualities in Graham. Although, honestly, I was very conscious of the kind of seductive power of Graham technique. In a way, it's a little bit of a closed system, like beautifully, because everything suggests the next moment. So when I began to choreograph, I would often, you know, even though my body was sort of filled with patterns from Graham technique, I would on purpose try and subvert those patterns so I wasn't a prisoner of that, let's say. So that's when I began to want to do more ballet. And I loved jumping in a way that wasn't really part of the Graham vocabulary. I loved moving quickly. And then at a certain moment, I discovered different sort of somatic modalities, different ways of moving that weren't based in traditional technical systems. And those were fascinating to me. Working with Stephanie Skura for the first time, for example, where her work with Joan Skinner and Skinner releasing was a revelation for me. And then, of course, the huge one for me was my encounter with Deborah Hay, when I was already in my early 50s. And it was, for whatever reason, it was a moment where I found a teacher that I completely submitted to without any holding back. And that was a really, I learned so much about myself in that time. David came to me and said that they'd had a meeting and they decided that they were going to, this would have been 1981, make me a resident choreographer for the company. So incredibly generous from the get-go. I made a piece called Scola Cantorum to some Eric Satie, a piece to John Cage called Fleet. I made Glass Houses and Southam's Music in 1983, animated shorts in 1984. Yeah, I was choreographing all the time, and you know, I guess I was teaching myself how to choreograph. And then things got scary because we went to New York in 1985, way deep Brooklyn, at Brooklyn College. And for some reason, Anna Kisselgoff, who was the chief critic at the New York Times, came and reviewed the program and said some very complimentary things about me. And then suddenly I was a choreographer. It's hard to be an artistic director and a choreographer. And it was at a time of change, and I was completely sort of unproven as a director. So, and the company had quite a large deficit when I took over. So everything was a little bit probationary for a while. And there were so many changes. I think I made a lot of mistakes, my assumptions about what I needed, how I needed to behave, what I needed to do, in retrospect, was just a function of my insecurity and my desire to do it well. The bigger issue was that for maybe 3 or 4 years, it was extremely stressful, and the work that I was making reflected that. There was this sense of just having to, a little bit to feed this machine where it had changed. There was a lightness that had disappeared. And yeah, and that was very challenging. I'm not quite sure why I stayed, other than I like to solve problems. Probably like by 90, 98, so yeah, 4 years. Then things shifted. There's huge turnover in the company. Different kinds of dancers came to the company who were interested, who were maybe more specifically interested in what I was trying to do, rather than wishing that things were what they were like when they joined. There was a shift in 2000 when I started. I mean, this is interesting, because I was thinking maybe it was time to go and it was time to get out of dance. I felt maybe I had done as much as I could do as a maker, really. So I went to Banff for a month and holed up in the Margaret Leighton colony in one of those little studios, and just lived in the performing arts library and reading and watching things and dancing around a little bit. And after 2 weeks, I thought, okay, I'm definitely getting out of dance. There are lots of other things I'm interested in. And then 2 weeks later, I went, no, dance isn't the problem. It's the way I'm understanding it. That's the problem. So I gave myself permission to maybe to make my work much more personal. And that's when I started doing pieces like Nest and Severe Clear and Persephone's Lunch that solved all kinds of problems at once. They were a bit more fun. They were much more collaborative. Like, all of the contentious things like casting went away because everyone was in it and everyone was involved in creating their own role within the thing. So everyone owned the piece. There's something about the philosophy of performance which draws a little bit of a line in the sand, and it's one of those things, once it's out of the box, you can't put it back in. You know, once known, it can't be unlearned, for better, for worse. And the essence of that work is really less about showing something that you've prepared and more about inviting being seen in this process of continued research and becoming, which doesn't mean you're flying by the seat of your pants. It's the opposite. It's the same kind of rigor. It's the same kind of preparation, but the experience of the audience is very different because the experience of the performer is very different. I guess in simplest terms, every performance is a rehearsal for what that piece might become. And every rehearsal is a performance. So there's no, of course that's impossible, but you try to be performing, to be practicing what you're doing on stage all the time. So there's no difference. And then, if things go well, you avoid that, and this works with a group as well, you avoid that thing where you have this phenomenally beautiful, relaxed run in the afternoon where everyone is making these spontaneous and quite risky choices that just land perfectly, and then suddenly it's like the final exam is the performance. And things don't have that same spontaneity or authenticity in a way. And this is also part of this idea of adrenaline, which is so interesting, because when you first start to perform, one of the addictive things about it is when you get that shot of adrenaline, you're like, oh my God, I am flying. You just feel so great. And then you do the second show and it feels like garbage because the same thing doesn't happen. But it turns out that adrenaline is like any drug, any chemical needs to be used in moderation. And that's also part of Deborah's language, this idea of regulating your adrenaline, so that the moment you feel you're getting excited, you learn how to calm down. I was really lucky. I got support to make a solo, which I presented in maybe 2022, just at the end of the pandemic, which I've been touring a little bit, maybe in 5 different cities. And I think I'm going to do again in Toronto just after my 70th birthday. So that will be fun to go back to the Citadel to do that, and then we'll see. I'm one of those weirdos, and I think I'm really lucky, and then I've always loved training. So it's never been a thing I have to do in order to, and that's in any physical activity. I just love being able to do that. So I will keep dancing, I think, until I can't walk, and then I don't know, bob my head or whatever. We'll see. I was reading an artist, David Wojnarowicz, someone who's really inspiring to me. And he actually died of AIDS, visual artist and writer, East Village scene in the 80s. And he talks about not wanting to arrive at something, but always being in transition. And I think that that's part of, it's the thing that I enjoy is the possibility of, as you say, continuing to learn.